Imagine a food so dangerous, so poisonous that you don't want to touch it, let alone eat it. That food is the tomato. There's a famous story from 1820 in Salem, New Jersey, where a young man says that he is going to eat a tomato on the courthouse steps, and people came from miles around to view this spectacle because they thought, well, I don't really know what they thought was going to happen because they didn't know. They were just afraid. They were afraid of what would happen if this young man took a big bite of a tomato. He might drop dead right then and there. But it turns out that there are so many stories exactly like the story where somebody is going to eat a tomato, people come from miles around to see, and we don't really know which ones happened and which ones didn't and why it was such a spectacle. We don't know why everybody was so interested in this. Thomas Jefferson is claimed to being the first person to eat a tomato at one point. I don't think anybody really knew what the worry was. They were just worried. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that the world was so small at this time. There were people in other countries all over the place that were eating tomatoes every single day. They'd been doing it for a long time and had diets based around that. But in America and England, we didn't know that. We didn't know the extent of it. We used tomatoes for different purposes, or else we didn't touch them at all. Now today, if something happens in Asia, in Indiana, I know about it 5 minutes later, but that is not the case for the time period. News did not travel fast, and there was definitely a stigma based around this particular fruit that people were just afraid of it. Now in England, there were people that were writing scientific papers in the time period, and they were using tomatoes medicinally. They would say we grow them because they're beautiful plants, they're great to look at, and they have medicinal properties. All the while, some of these people even knew that in other parts of the world they were eaten, but they didn't trust that, so they didn't publish it. There were some folks that were so afraid of these plants that they didn't even want to touch them. Some people were just like, I don't want to touch it because I'm going to stink for days because these things smell terribly. Other people, they didn't know what would happen if they touched it. They were literally terrified. Tomato juice was really big as far as treating eye inflammation and cataracts. That was kind of the basis for the medicinal use for a long time. And as we progress throughout time and we get into the mid-1700s, you start to see people in England eating tomatoes. And prior to that, that was being used for all sorts of things, inflammation, soreness. I mean, I've read lists and lists of different uses for medicinal tomatoes, and it covered about everything that could go wrong with the human body. So they started trusting it more and more, and eventually they felt like they could eat it. But it took a long, long time. If you ask somebody today, why were people in our time period afraid of tomatoes, the most common answer is going to be that they were part of the nightshades family. And I think that there's some truth to that. Although what I don't understand, and maybe you guys can help me in the comment section because I've researched a lot on this and I can't pinpoint like an actual answer. Why would being part of the nightshades family keep people from eating it? Tobacco is part of the nightshades family. Potatoes are part of the nightshades family. They ate those all the time. They smoked tobacco. They even chewed tobacco some. Snuff was very popular in the time period, especially in England. So why are they accepting those plants and not other plants like a lot of peppers and tomatoes especially? I don't really know the answer to that. And maybe it's because they're classified in the nightshades family with tobacco and potatoes now, and maybe they weren't so much then. Maybe it was a regional thing. There's an answer somewhere, but for the life of me, I can't find something to pinpoint as this is the exact reason. One of the main problems with researching tomatoes, even researching various topics in our time period, is you have to understand the nomenclature at the time. You have to know how they're referring to a tomato or sourdough or something like that in the time period. And oftentimes it's not the word tomato. So a lot of recipes from this time period were using the term love apples. And that is a tomato. That's what they were calling them. There's this really wonderful book that John suggested to me when I told him that I wanted to run down the tomato rabbit hole. It's called The Tomato in America, and it's by Andrew F. Smith. And this book has been just a great research tool. It's wonderful. If anybody is interested in tomatoes in America and kind of the history of tomatoes, this is a wonderful book. So I dug into this book and it helped me figure out a timeline of when tomatoes are being used, or at least written down, referenced, for the first time in various countries around the world, and it's very, very enlightening. The British tomato. Although tomatoes have been cultivated in continental Europe since the 1540s, they were not grown in England until 1590s. John Gerard, a barber surgeon, planted them in Holborn in the College of Physicians' Gardens that he superintended. So in 1590, they are starting to cultivate tomatoes in England, but this is strictly educational. We have records of people eating tomatoes in 1608 in Italy, and as early as 1529 in Mexico. Obviously, that's when they're being recorded, but they're eating tomatoes well before that in Mexico. I mean, the Aztec people were using tomatoes, and that's very early, and they're making even a salsa at the time period. So dishes that we're eating now regularly, every time we go out to eat, were being created hundreds of years ago out of something that was supposedly poisonous. Tomatoes in the colonies in the States and in England and other parts of Europe were thought to be dangerous and rank smelling well into the 19th century. But we do start to see them around the early 1700s being used in certain soups. They're good to make a broth with. People are starting to feel like there are certain occasions where if they're cooked properly or if they're extremely ripe, then you can use them. And that continues in 1750s. We start to see English cookbooks that are including Spanish recipes that have tomatoes in them. And by the 1780s, a lot of people were feeling pretty comfortable with cooking with tomatoes. Today we are going to cook with tomatoes. And it's from a 1758 supplement to the Art of Cookery, which is really interesting because that is the most popular cookbook in England in the time period, bar none. And so in 1758, there's the supplement that's added to the book, and it has to cook haddock the Spanish way. Take 2 fine haddocks, scale, gut, and wash them well. Wipe them with a cloth and broil them. Put a pint of sweet oil in the stew pan, season it with pepper and salt, a little cloves, mace, nutmeg beaten, 2 cloves of garlic chopped. Pare half a dozen love apples and quarter them when in season. Put them in, and a spoonful of vinegar. Put in the fish and stew them very gently for half an hour over a slow fire. Put them in a hot dish and garnish with lemon. There are basically 2 parts to this recipe. The first thing that we're going to do is prepare our fish. And so we're going to wash that off, and I'm going to dry it off, get it ready, probably do a light seasoning on it. And in this context, when they say broil, it means they want you to grill it. So we're going to use a gridiron or something like a double brazier. It's going to cook quickly now, so we don't want to go overboard. And also, we're going to stew this after the fact very lightly. Meanwhile, we're going to get our oil and our tomatoes and all of our spices into a stew pan. We're going to get that going. We're going to make a nice sauce. And then once we've grilled our fish, we're going to add it to that and just do a light simmer for about a half hour and let everything cook together. It's going to be fantastic. At the end, we're going to cut up some lemons, and we're going to put that around as a garnish. You can squirt some lemon juice on your fish if you would like to. I cannot wait to try this. The aromas from this dish have filled the kitchen, and it smells incredible. The clove and pepper I was kind of heavy-handed with because I like some spice. It's hard to say what's a spoonful of vinegar, so you flavor that to taste. Now, I think that the haddock stewing in this mixture really seeped a lot of that in, so I'm excited to try a chunk of that and see how much flavor it took in from the stew. I'm not used to cooking with so much oil, and so I want to see what that tastes like with the tomatoes and everything. Let's give it a shot. Oh yeah, that fish is perfect. It is so flaky, it's light. The oil's not overpowering. It doesn't feel like it's coating my tongue. The garlic really comes through. This is a fantastic dish. You have to try this at home.